At a time when conceptual art was still at its infancy and disregarded by the art establishment, Joseph Beuys managed to cut through the cynicism and the archaic attitude of the time and put conceptual art amongst one of the great developments in art history. Beuys's 1969 piece, The Pack, displays a series of toboggans or sledges, carting animal fat and felt away from the man-made structure of a Volkswagen bus. The viewer is able to navigate all the way around the large piece and feels part of this complex narrative straight from the bizarre mind of Beuys himself. I believe the very nature of conceptualism is to be idea-based, to allow an idea to become the machine that creates the art. But here I believe Beuys goes one step further. Not only is it an idea that he's pushing, I believe it's a complex narrative straight from the bizarre mind of the artist himself. I first saw this piece in 2005 when I was about 8 or 9 years old in the Tate Modern. And it had a massive impact on me to the point where I'm here 10 years later talking to you about it. Sure, when I first saw it, I was probably more tempted to have a go in one of the sledges than to actually consider the piece. But the strangeness of being presented with this pack of toboggans had a lasting impact on me and has ultimately made me want to find out more about the incredibly complex work of Beuys himself. Born in pre-war Germany in 1921, Beuys was not exposed to the liberal ideas upheld by our culture and American culture, and consequently, his exposure to modern art was minimal. In 1941, he joined the Luftwaffe and was stationed in Eastern Europe. This was at the height of the brutal warfare that was taking part during the war. To me, it is imperative at this point to understand that this part of Beuys's life would not only affect his career as an artist, but his whole life philosophy, carving out for him the moral path he'd be walking down until his death 40 years later. In 1944, he was shot down over the Crimea. The geography of this land is hugely unforgiving for anyone to survive, let alone someone sustaining serious injuries, particularly burns, from a plane crash. Discovered by the nomadic Tartar tribespeople of the area, he was saved by being wrapped in animal fat and felt and transported to a nearby camp where he was cared for. He woke up 12 days later in a German field hospital with only mental images penetrated onto his consciousness. With this understanding of Beuys's life, the piece becomes instantly symbolic for me, an illustration of the hardship to which he was subject during the war. On a visit to the same gallery last year, I saw Beuys's colossal work, Lightning with a Stag in its Glare, and I was reminded at this point through Fat and Felt of the piece I'd seen a decade before. It struck me at this point that these were not just tools used by Beuys to create his pieces of art. They were metaphors that were rooted much deeper in his mind. He didn't pick fat, felt, and wood as 3 common materials because he liked working with them. He picked them because of their significance to him. They were ultimately the reason he was able to continue to make his art. They represent to me not only the fertility of life, they represent human perseverance and our willingness to survive, even in times of conflict. Beuys presents these themes and recurring motifs in the pack as he does in all of his work. Symbolic reminders to us as the audience and to himself that when threatened, we will fight to survive. The sledges to me represent kind of medical stretchers, an implement commonly used on the battlefield of removing the wounded to safety, an implement of ensuring the protection for the weak. It is a symbol for me of how from help from others we can survive through almost anything. A symbol that Germany, even though it suffered a great amount during the war, could still survive and stand on its own 2 feet again. To me, the rest of the world would have to provide the stretcher, or in this case the sledge, for this healing process to begin. It is no surprise then that Beuys would later become a pacifist, a hardline opponent to nuclear weapons, and a founding member of Germany's Green Party. These sledges are leaving a Volkswagen vehicle parked on one side of the room. I believe this is key in supporting the idea that they are taking with them this feeling of pain and suffering away from the future. The Volkswagen car manufacturing company itself was this symbol of economic redemption and rejuvenation in a country stripped of everything in 1945. They represent a rejuvenation in German industry, offering a hope for a brighter future. Beuys uses this bus as a symbol for the future, this symbol of hope that so many Germans needed after the war. These sledges are leaving this vehicle from the rear and taking with them this feeling of national guilt. The action of being wrapped in felt, to me, is almost evocative of nursing a newborn baby, or in this case, rebirth. The artist would often incorporate himself being wrapped in this material. For example, in this piece, I like America and America likes me. The artist was saved by the nomads, practically dead, and yet with their help and medication, he was able to survive what most couldn't. To me, this is comparable to the rebirth of Germany's economic power, regaining position in the First World's industrial world. The piece was created in 1969 with this knowledge that Germany was on a steady path to recovery. Beuys had suffered severe depression during the 1950s, and like many people of his age, it's been attributed to post-traumatic stress disorder. Beuys was someone, to me, who knew that intellect could hit harder than any missile. And I believe that this piece was intended not just as a pacifist statement by the artist, but also as medication to help him cope with the suffering to which he was subject during the war. He combated this depression by moving forward and progressing. It was at this point in the early 1960s when he moved into teaching. His artistic philosophies would often spill into his teaching methods, and frequently he was criticized for doing this. An important philosophy of his was exemplified in his performance piece, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare. Here he tells this dead animal of his practices, representing the fact that no one needs to know the ideas behind a piece, particularly one of a conceptual nature. Beuys's injections of humor and weirdness are intentionally provoking a response from us as the audience. However, with The Pack, I feel there's something different here. Certainly my 9-year-old self wanted to understand why there was a series of toboggans roaming the floors of the Tate. And I believe at the surface there was a simple explanation. Beuys's autobiographical piece helps him deal with and express what happened to him during the war, and helps others who are like him find comfort in the fact that they are not alone. It is in fact debated as to whether or not the nomads in Beuys's story even existed. I, like many others, don't believe that they did, but I also believe it's irrelevant when one takes into account the context of his work. Beuys's fascination with mythology would often spill into his life and his art. And here, I believe he created this kind of mythical reference point onto which he could hang all of his intellectual thought. I find Beuys's work almost as compelling as the man himself, someone who has inspired me to consider what I'm looking at as opposed to taking it at face value. Even when I first saw The Pack, I knew it was more than just a depiction of a claustrophobic toboggan race. And consequently, I feel the fact that I've revisited it just proves how compelling it actually is. I was watching a film featuring Richard DeMarco, the man who introduced Beuys to Scotland. In this film, a Minneapolis-based art advisor named Todd Bockley discusses the key feature of Beuys's work to be inspiring others to take action with their art. I believe Beuys inspiring others to take action with their art is as important as Picasso inspiring others to paint. I, for one, feel inspired when considering the way in which Beuys approached his art and his philosophy of helping others find their voice. To me, this is what art is all about. Thank you.
And Joseph Beuys. I think this idea of Joseph Beuys and his metaphor, I think was, really well presented. I think you held the room. Those kind of tricks where you're meant to kind of catch somebody's eye and talk to them just for a wee moment. And then over here, I thought that was convincing. I think Beuys has lots of really complex and interesting ideas which can quite easily be muddled up, and I thought you kind of showed some clarity, which was good. And I liked your observation that could we say that Beuys was kind of using these materials to self-medicate after these traumatic events in his life. And I liked your end, artists finding a voice. So thanks for that.